On the morning of November 13th, a 911 call was made at 11:58 a.m. reporting an unconscious person at the residence. Moscow police responded and found 2 victims on the 2nd floor and 2 victims on the 3rd floor.
But he was stalking them, he was hunting them.
In conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Police, Federal Bureau of Investigation, detectives arrested 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger for murder of Ethan, Zana, Madison, and Kaylee.
The Idaho Four, the most controversial case in recent history. Opinions have been split since Bryan Kohberger was arrested out of nowhere. Why are police so confident they have their man? And what does the prosecution want you to believe? Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born 29 years ago on November 29th, 1994, in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, to parents Mary Ann and Michael Kohberger. They made it by as a family of 5, having public school pensions. However, things were often difficult for the Kohbergers, having filed for bankruptcy twice, in 1996 and 2010. Bryan was the youngest child, having 2 older sisters, Melissa and Amanda.
Bryan Kohberger's sister appears in a gory slasher film.
Puts me out of my mind.
Years earlier, in 2011, she had a part in a low-budget film 2 Days Back. The movie has a typical horror movie plot: students who venture into the woods only to be slashed to death. Her name appears in the credits.
Opinions differ on who Bryan was as a youngster. He changed his personalities often, whether it be personal growth or something a lot more sinister.
He's almost like a chameleon. It depends on where you are.
He aspired to be an Army Ranger. A classmate of Kohberger's from here at Pleasant Valley High School in Pennsylvania has reportedly said that the now quadruple murder suspect was out of shape and overweight in his younger years until he took a boxing class. And that's when the friend says his whole demeanor changed. He became aggressive and was always looking to pick fights.
It was after that weight loss that a lot of people noticed a huge switch in him. My brother has since come out to say that even though they were friends, Bryan bullied him. He would put him in like chokeholds and stuff like that.
He's a man that some say is brilliant, a man who commands the room. He applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department. He said he wanted to learn about rural law enforcement.
Kohberger graduating from high school and college, becoming a PhD student in criminal justice at Washington State University.
Was this deep interest in the criminal mind a telltale sign?
One of the things that professors in this field, in criminal justice and law enforcement, we always worry about this. It's always in the back of your head, right? That somebody you're teaching, you're training, however you want to look at it, could end up using it for something bad.
Retired NYPD homicide detective and criminologist Professor Joseph Jacalone says, though, studying criminology, even at an advanced level, doesn't make someone a master criminal.
Maybe he's a little arrogant in regards to that. And I think some of that is coming out. People think that they're smarter than the cops and they're going to get away with these things.
You had a guest who served as Kohberger's former administrator at a career and technical institute he worked at. And she called attention to his issues even back then with women. Here's the clip.
Some of the issues that arose were based on having a mixed population in that classroom. One of those incidents ultimately resulted in him being removed from that program.
She says Kohberger's kicked out of Protective Services, the program he works so diligently to get into in the first place. The school transfers him into the HVAC program, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. This program has no female students.
We were also a little bit more comfortable knowing that any possible continuation of negative behaviors would not occur in a situation where there were no females.
Guys, let's talk about this some, because we know when we go back and look at the profiles of killers, whether it's school shooters, whether it's serial killers, mass shooters, we do know that these are people that did not have happy childhoods typically, that sometime in their early upbringing there was a childhood trauma. We also know that they tend to feel marginalized, and that unresolved childhood trauma comes to a crisis point sometime in their adult life. We don't know necessarily what triggers it. We don't know what brings it about, but it's almost always there. It's almost always a path to violence in some way. And here, when you look at what happened with him, he was overweight, he was mocked. We do know that the report from the bar near his home reported that he was asked to not come into the bar anymore because he was going up to women and asking them if they lived alone.
Yeah.
Right. That's not a real icebreaker.
No. It was a real creep factor. A lot of those women were very concerned.
It says something that he did it enough times that the wait staff went to the owner and said something, and he had it on
But
file.
what also it says is that he's not reading the room enough to know this is not a way to start a conversation with a woman, which again speaks to the awkwardness and the narcissism. You're not reading the room when you walk up to an attractive young woman and ask her if she lives alone, and the reaction is such that they ask you to stop coming to the bar.
Right.
You should, if you are dialed in at all, if you are reading the reactions, you would say, that's not working.
Right.
I need to say, can I buy you a drink, or, what do you like to do, or anything besides, do you live alone?
And he was apparently flabbergasted when the owner of the bar told him, you can't do this anymore.
He's not reading that, which tells you something about him.
Right.
Newly uncovered social media posts painting a clearer picture of who Bryan Kohberger was as a teen, where he shared struggles with mental health and thoughts of suicide. Kohberger writing in 2011, "As I hug my family, I look into their faces, I see nothing. It is like I'm looking at a video game, but less." Kohberger also writing he experienced depression, a constant thought of suicide, crazy thoughts, and delusions of grandeur, saying, "I feel no emotion, and along with the depersonalization, I can say and do whatever I want with little remorse."
Bryan Kohberger was someone who was struggling a lot in his teenage years about, what was going on in his mind and trying to figure it out and how to resolve it.
Kohberger commiserating with other users about a neurological condition he says he suffered from called visual snow, where a person sees dots across their line of sight, similar to static on a television. Posting in 2010, "My mind is never not on visual snow. This whole thing has made me crazy. I feel like my life is pointless because people can think about times with parents, childhood memories, and be happy, and I won't be able to."
He's talking on one hand about the visual symptoms that he's dealing with, but at the same time, there really is a sense of desperation.
In 2012, in his account's final post on the forum, Kohberger writing he finally accepted his condition, saying, quote, "It doesn't scare me anymore."
While Bryan was completing his PhD in criminology, 4 young students were just getting a start at life, nearing undergraduate degrees of their own.
I want to take a moment to tell you about each of them tonight. We'll start with Ethan Chapin. He was from Conway, Washington, had just turned 20 years old the month before he was killed. He was one of 3 triplets. His brother and sister were students alongside him here at the University of Idaho. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity. In the years since his death, they have raised more than $125,000 for the Ethan Chapin Memorial Scholarship Fund. He was dating Xana Kernodle, who was also killed.
And Xana was 20 years old. She was originally from Arizona, but then moved to Post Falls and went to Post Falls High School, where she was active in volleyball, track, and soccer. She was a junior majoring in marketing at the College of Business and Economics. She was also a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority. And according to her family, she loved her dog, electronic dance music, and going on family trips with her sister and father.
Kaylee Gonzalez was 21 years old and one of 5 kids. She has been described by her parents as the ultimate middle child. She was from Rathdrum, Idaho, and majoring in general studies and was planning a trip to Europe after she graduated. Her sister said that Kaylee was constantly chasing adventure and was going to move to Texas to live with her sister when she had a job with an IT firm all lined up in Austin.
Now, Kaylee's best friend was 21-year-old Madison Mogan, who went by the name of Maddie. Some describe those two as close as sisters. Maddie was a senior, a marketing major, and a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority. She loved the color pink and planned to move to Boise after she graduated to be closer to her boyfriend. Her father described her as the light of his life.
Video appears to show two of the students walking down the street and talking, how they spent some of their last hours alive. Fox News Digital believes it was recorded on November 13th, just a couple of hours before the four were stabbed to death in their off-campus home. The footage shows Kaylee Goncalves and Maddie Mogan walking with a man on Main Street in downtown Moscow. Two women appear to be wearing the same clothes that Goncalves and Mogan were seen wearing earlier that evening near a food truck. The man walking with them is also wearing clothes that look like those worn by a man who was also seen at the food truck.
The flag is at half-staff at the University of Idaho Sigma Chi fraternity house. The last place victims Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were seen alive, according to police.
The kids might not have known Bryan, but he very well might have known them.
One of the biggest leaks in the Idaho case so far might finally lead us towards what the motive might have been in the killings. A law enforcement source tells People magazine that investigators now have digital evidence that suspect Bryan Kohberger was persistently DMing one of the four victims before the murders took place on November 13th. Now, the source does not identify which one of the four victims was receiving these DMs, but those who have been following the case very closely, people have already been pointing this out online. News Nation reported, you might remember, that Kaylee Goncalves, her injuries were far more severe than those of Maddie, Xana, and Ethan's. Now, the source told People magazine's Steve Heller, I'll read the quote here, he slid into one of the girl's DMs several times, but she didn't respond. Basically, it was just him saying, hey, how are you? But he did it again and again. The source also acknowledged that the recipient of these messages, again, one of the four victims, might not have seen those messages on social media. It's important to note, too, that this is a single law enforcement source. In the article, they make no mention of a second source to corroborate, and whoever leaked this information to People magazine, they risked their law enforcement career and the process, given the gag order that exists right now in Idaho with this case. Now, if true, these DMs, valuable evidence for prosecutors, but again, leaves major questions. Why did the suspect kill three more people in the house and then also, too, leave two roommates completely unharmed? We'll continue to follow what's going on with the Idaho case. You can follow right here on social media, the very latest as well, on WFLA.com, the WFLA app.
Also, that cell phone evidence, according to the affidavit, shows that he was in the area of that home on at least 12 occasions between August and November 13th.
In reference to the cell phone, I guess he was brilliant enough to turn it off when he was in there doing what he was allegedly doing, but he wasn't smart enough or didn't think about the fact that he needed to turn it off the entire time that he's making his reconnaissance of that structure and those people.
Investigators had a lot of surveillance video to work with, in addition to tracking Kohberger's cell phone in those hours leading up to and following the murders. All of it helped them put together what they believe is the path Bryan Kohberger took to and from the King Road residence that morning.
According to the affidavit and surveillance video, it is believed that Bryan Kohberger left this apartment complex shortly before 2:45 in the morning on November 13th. Surveillance video on WSU's campus has that suspect's car driving toward Highway 270, which connects Pullman to Moscow, around 2:50 on November 13th. The white Hyundai Elantra is next tracked going westbound on Indian Hills Drive, just east of Main Street in Moscow, around 3:26. and 2 minutes later, westbound on Steiner Avenue at Main Street. Court documents say multiple surveillance videos catch the same Elantra in the King Road neighborhood at 3:29 in the morning. These videos show the vehicle making 3 passes in the area before leaving on Walenta Drive. Then, around 4:04 a.m., the suspect returns a 4th time.
Your destination is on the right. You have arrived at 1122 King Road.
Next, the vehicle is captured leaving the area of the King Road house at a high speed at 4:20 a.m. Another surveillance video catches the Elantra driving south on Walenta Drive again. Around 4:50 in the morning, his phone was tracked near Blaine, Idaho. Further tracking was consistent with Kohberger traveling south to Genesee, west to Uniontown, and north back into Pullman.
Interesting, the next morning, without turning his cell phone off, taking it with him in the white Hyundai Elantra, he makes the most direct path from his apartment here in Pullman to Moscow, where the crime scene is. According to this affidavit, at 9:12 a.m., he's in Moscow, Idaho, at the crime scene, stays about 10 minutes, and then returns back on that direct route to Pullman. He's home by 9:32, I believe is what the affidavit says. So then, later that afternoon, he makes his way south. 12:36, he is now south, about 50 minutes away in Clarkston, Washington, through Lewiston, at Kate's Cup of Joe. He doesn't get a cup of coffee there. He doesn't stop in and get a cup of coffee. He's driving past this. His phone pings there. A couple blocks away, he's at Albertson's grocery store. It's all right there together, Vinny. He's going in the store. He's seen all surveillance video. I've been in this store. There are security cameras all over this store. They can see what he's buying. They don't say it in the affidavit, but they can see what he's buying. There's security cameras above the checkout counters, so they know what he bought there. They just aren't telling us, Vinny. And his Hyundai Elantra is seen there as well. He leaves Albertsons about 1:04 p.m.
Tonight, a community mourns as police make a plea for anyone to come forward with information.
Our top story tonight takes us to Moscow, Idaho, where 4 University of Idaho students were found dead Sunday. Police have just ended a press conference. In that conference, we learned just how little is known about the murder suspect or suspects.
As law enforcement and the public grew more and more desperate for information on the killer, Bryan surely felt the heat. His demeanor seemingly changed at the university shortly after November 13th.
He was pretty strict as far as grading goes. When he came into class, he was very, not super mentally present. He would stand up at the front, look at the ground. He had a lot of like boilerplate responses he would give people rather than, maybe something he had thought up on the spot. It seemed like he would be, he'd come in knowing what he was going to say to like most interactions. And then when he would grade your papers, he would be grading you on what he ended up calling like a higher standard. But what it really felt like to us was he was grading us like he would have graded himself as a PhD student. And so that was just kind of like, we were all annoyed by him. And so I knew his name, I knew like, oh, T.A. Bryan, like he sucks at this. Like he's grading us too harshly. And that was like an annoyance. But obviously beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird and kind of, a bad grader. Yeah. We just, it would have been about a month before winter break when like the murders happened. And we didn't obviously build our framework for this around that because we had no reason to connect him to that, at the time. But definitely around then, he started grading everybody just 100s. Not like you pretty much if you turned something in, you were getting high marks. And he stopped leaving notes. It was just, he seemed preoccupied is what I would have said at the time. And now obviously he seems like he was probably pretty preoccupied. But it was much easier. You'd turn in whatever you wanted pretty much. And he was just grading them up and sending them back. Like he probably, that I saw, he was always a little bit spotty on whether or not he'd come to class because he had, whatever PhD stuff over the top of it. But the couple times that he did come after or around that time period, I remember him, he had like a little bit more facial hair, just like stubble, but definitely less like well kept than he was. And he was a little quieter. He used to stand up at the start of class and like talk about some stuff sometimes. And this time he didn't really do that at all. He was definitely, I think, like the previous like mental preoccupation that we had been noticing where it was like, he didn't really want to be there. That was at like an all-time high. And he just, didn't look like he was doing great.
Good afternoon, folks. My name's Bill Thompson. I'm the Latah County prosecutor. And it's sad to be here, but happy to be here at the same time. As Chief Fry indicated, a criminal complaint was filed yesterday here in Latah County, charging the defendant, Mr. Kohberger, with 4 counts of first-degree murder, in addition to felony burglary, which involves entering the residence with the intent to commit the crime of murder. Mr. Kohberger, and let me preface, there is a pending case now in court, and I and my office and the investigators have to live with the restrictions that our Supreme Court places on pretrial publicity.
Bryan Kohberger touching down after a cross-country extradition flight and turned over to a convoy of heavily armed local law enforcement, ready to serve him with an arrest warrant for the first-degree murders of 4 University of Idaho students.
Just good old-fashioned detective work. I said from the beginning that that's what's going to crack this case. And that's what they did. These guys hit the grindstone and put their noses to it. And one of the first things they're going to do, and we talked about this before, Jesse, is that they're going to go out there and they're going to try to draw from any kind of video surveillance evidence that they can draw from. And that's exactly what they did.
And just yesterday, the prosecution filed their intent to seek the death penalty if a jury finds Kohberger guilty.
The family wants to move along. They want to get a conviction and move past this as much as you can move past a case like this.
He was indicted by a grand jury last month. He chose to stand silent at his arraignment, prompting the judge to enter not guilty pleas on his behalf.
Do you understand these rights?
Yes.
Just 5 days after Kohberger's arrest, law enforcement released the probable cause affidavit, allowing more insight into the evidence against Bryan. Included in the PCA was maybe the most important piece of evidence they had, a knife sheath.
While information continues to emerge about the quadruple homicide case on the University of Idaho campus, with a knife sheath found at that crime scene expected to be key evidence.
This is the sheath, and it was on this snap of the sheath. This snap right here that was swabbed, and that's where that little bit of a DNA profile began. So that's where it all started. Now, investigators didn't know whose DNA it was on the snap. They just were able to get somebody's DNA here. And as they continued investigating, they honed in on Bryan Kohberger. Was found on a bed next to the bodies of Madison and Kaylee. Remember, these were the roommates. They were sharing the bed together that night. Best of friends. The sheath was found face down, partially under both Madison's body and the comforter on the bed.
According to this unsealed affidavit of probable cause, first, an Idaho lab located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of a knife sheath next to one of the stabbing victims.
Since initial testing at a lab in Idaho could not connect Kohberger to the crime scene. Now, according to an affidavit, the knife sheath was sent to a lab in Texas. The Texas lab had only been used for cold cases in the past. Lab workers used kinship DNA on the knife to actually match with Kohberger's father.
Parents' home in Pennsylvania. It turns out that house is where critical DNA evidence was harvested from the trash. Then, DNA from the trash and DNA from the knife sheath identified a male who could not be excluded as the biological father of Kohberger.
The FBI further compared DNA from the sheath to a cheek swab of the defendant, what's called a buccal swab taken. If you hear that, it's a cheek swab. They stick what looks like a Q-tip into the cheek, swab it around, and they're able to take that. Once he was arrested, they're able to do that per court order. And they did DNA test number 2 and confirmed that it was a match.
Police department search warrant, come to the door.
The night Kohberger was arrested at his parents' Pennsylvania home in December, officers in Washington state served a search warrant at his apartment.
We are learning more about what police seized from Bryan Kohberger's apartment the day that he was arrested for the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. I'm Anjanette Levy, and thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. The search warrant for Bryan Kohberger's apartment in Pullman, Washington was unsealed just a short time ago. This came as a little bit of a surprise because this document was supposed to remain sealed until March 1st of this year. When sealing the document, the judge said he believed it could endanger the investigation or possibly the victims in this case, or possibly end the investigation early if the documents were made public, possibly tipping off the suspect. Bryan Kohberger, of course, was arrested in Pennsylvania at his parents' home on December 30th for the murders of Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin at their home on King Road in Moscow, Idaho, back on November 13th. For weeks, the community was terrified. They were frightened because it appeared a killer was on the loose, and it looked like there weren't any suspects. But we later learned that police kind of had eyes on Bryan Kohberger at the beginning of or the middle of December. So let's take a look at what investigators actually seized from Bryan Kohberger's apartment when they executed that search warrant back on December 30th. The return for the search warrant says 1 nitrite glove was seized along with a Walmart receipt with 1 Dickies tag, 2 Marshall's receipts, a dust container from a Bissell Power Force vacuum, 8 possible hair strands, 1 Fire TV stick with cord and plug, 1 possible animal hair strand, and other possible hairs and a possible hair strand. 1 computer tower, 1 collection of a dark red spot was taken. That was collected without testing, we believe, for presumptive blood. 2 cuttings from uncased pillows of reddish or brown stains. It says the larger stain was tested. And finally, 2 top and bottom of mattress covered package separately, both labeled C, and that there were multiple stains, and one of them was tested. So we believe it's possible that some of these reddish brown stains or at least one of them, could have contained blood. It doesn't explicitly state that. When applying for this search warrant, police said they were interested in anything in that apartment, including a knife or a sheath.
Better idea of what law enforcement took from Bryan Kohberger's car and parents' home. He's the man charged in connection with the murder of the 4 University of Idaho students. New unsealed documents revealing more items investigators took from Bryan Kohberger's car, as well as his parents' house. The 28-year-old is accused of killing University of Idaho students Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin back in November. The documents show investigators found a knife, a pocket knife, a Glock 22 handgun, 3 empty magazines, and a black face mask. They also took a book that underlined something on page 118. It's unclear what that book was or what was underlined.
Regarding that highlighted page 118, many thought it was Bryan's ex-professor, Katherine Ramsland, who has written many books about crime in the past. A more likely theory was that the book was a manifesto written by Elliot Rodger, a mass killer who took their own life in 2014. It is speculated that Bryan was using an alias as an ode to Elliot, calling himself Papa Rodger.
On November 30th, this Papa Rodger made a post. I believe the killers came from the high side of the house. They were covered in blood after the attack. Papa Rodger made this post on December 8th. Thoughts on this body placement, and then attached like graphs and charts of the house and access points to the house. On November 30th, Papa Rodger posted, of the evidence released, the murder weapon has been consistent as a large fixed blade knife. This leads me to believe they found the sheath. This evidence was released prior to autopsies. Papa Rodger said this on December 13th. If the door was left open or the heat wasn't on, are we sure of the timeline of deaths? It was 28 degrees and overcast the night of the murders. December 13th, 1 knife and 4 people. The killer took a big risk. The knife could have easily broken off or become ineffective after 1 or 2 murders. Are we sure there is only 1 knife involved?
But a criminal psychology book was also listed among other items taken. The unsealed search warrants also mention authorities took a green, leafy substance in a green container and plastic bag. The documents show they took 63 items total. Earlier this week, a Pennsylvania court unsealed a search warrant detailing other items taken from Kohberger and his family home in Pennsylvania. Those items included a flashlight, 4 medical-style gloves, a t-shirt, and a black sweatshirt. Police arrested the 28-year-old in December at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. He is charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. And I also spoke with criminal attorney and former Idaho Attorney General David Leroy about this. He says some of the items found show potential significance while others may not, and there's no way to tell at this point. But items like a laptop were also taken, and that could help investigators find out what websites Kohberger accessed and potentially who he was in communication with. Kohberger remains in a Latah County jail. He's awaiting his preliminary hearing, which is scheduled for June 26th, and we have those documents posted in its entirety at ktvb.com.
During a search of a 2015 Hyundai Elantra, investigators say they found plastic Ziploc bags, goggles, and a shovel, along with a room key holder and stay information for a Comfort Inn.
Taking out like the pedals, the gas pedal, taking out the side trim pieces that, around the seat and those things. Those are what real interest to me because, again, if that vehicle was used, which we believe it was, may have been, used to transport him over to the scene, there is a possibility that there may be trace evidence that was left.
Kohberger's lawyer says before Christmas, Bryan's father flew from his home in the Poconos to Washington State to drive Bryan back home in their white Hyundai Elantra, the same car police believe was seen speeding away from the crime scene.
I stopped you, man, when you were driving by me there, you were a little too close to back that semi. About 1 car between you and the back of this trailer. About 1 car going 10 miles an hour, so you're going 60 or 70 miles an hour.
The Hyundai is going to be vital evidence.
There's no way
that he was able to go through a crime scene stabbing 4 people and didn't drag blood evidence and everything else with him into that car. So I'm sure investigators are looking to see the nearest car washing place, or if he had the car detailed, or he went to a local store and bought things to try to clean it up. I mean, and they all have surveillance video. So I think it's going to be really interesting how this plays out once tomorrow arrives.
I very carefully watched and listened and wrote down every significant word of his confrontation with a female police officer. What he did is he went out into a crosswalk and didn't come to a full stop, as I recall it, before he turned. Something maybe didn't put on his blinker, something you would normally think was fairly minor. Nobody was hurt. He gave her so much grief. You know, he would not have talked to a male officer the same way. And actually, we do know that because he was pulled over twice en route with his father in the car from where he was, near Idaho, all the way back home to the Poconos. And he stood up and saluted. Let me tell you, he gave those officers, when he was pulled over, the male officers, all the respect they could possibly hope for.
Hello, I am Officer Loangus. Stops being audio and video recorded. I think you know why I stopped you. You ran the red light.
What actually happened was I was stuck in the middle of the intersection.
Yeah,
so
I was behind you the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So technically, you're not supposed to enter the intersection at all for that reason, because if the light turns red, then you're stuck in the intersection, and then you run the red light. So that's the reason I stopped you. Do you have your license on you?
Yep. So would you explain that to me a little bit further? So in Pennsylvania, when you're stuck like in the intersection, you have to make the left. So what would the appropriate thing for me to have done been? Just
you're not supposed to block an intersection like that in Washington. So just by you blocking the intersection, that's technically a ticketable violation, and then you're running a red light, so it's another ticketable offense. So you're not supposed to proceed into the intersection until you can go, because a lot of people do what you just did, right? Is like you're sitting in the intersection waiting, and then turns, and then you're blocking. So
yeah, there was a little bit of confusion with speeding because someone had stopped. I wasn't sure what they were doing, and then they put on their light to turn. So I thought that maybe they were letting me go through.
Oh.
Did you see that?
No.
Yeah, like right before I made the turn, there was someone who like made a right. And they didn't have their signal on, so I wasn't sure if they were just waiting.
Another surprise to many, provided by the PCA, was the inclusion of a possible witness.
Dylan Mortensen, one of the 2 surviving roommates of the Idaho massacre, saw the killer in the house the night of the murders in the middle of the crime. We've also understood up until now that the 2 survivors slept in bedrooms on the 1st floor. However, we know now that Dylan was asleep on the 2nd floor and was able to see and hear the killer that way. According to police, Dylan told investigators that she was awoken at 4 a.m. by noises that sounded like Kaylee in a bedroom upstairs playing with her dog. Then a little while later, Dylan said that she heard something truly chilling. One of her roommates said, quote, "There's someone here." Now, she thought it was Kaylee's voice, but police think it may have been Xana because according to her phone records, Xana was awake at 4:12 a.m. and on TikTok. So Dylan peeks out of her bedroom but doesn't see anything. Then she hears what sounds like crying coming from Xana's room. So she looks out of her bedroom again, and that is when she hears a man saying something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," and we presume that man was the killer. So then Dylan opens her door for a 3rd time, and that is when she sees the killer standing in their living space, wearing all black, with a mask covering his nose and mouth. He walked towards her, past her, towards this sliding glass door, and police believe he left the crime scene. The next day, Dylan was able to give police a physical description of the suspect. She described him as tall, athletically built, and had bushy eyebrows.
This morning, the case against Bryan Kohberger inching closer to trial. The judge overseeing the case denying attempts by Kohberger's legal team to get the criminal charges against him thrown out. The judge finding his lawyers failed to challenge the indictment on grounds of juror bias, lack of sufficient evidence, or prosecutorial misconduct, adding Kohberger was indicted by an impartial grand jury.
This argument really is fighting against some case law.
The judge also rejecting a second defense motion that claimed prosecutors wrongly used a lower standard of proof when instructing the grand jury, calling the arguments, quote, interesting and creative, but ultimately unpersuasive.
But when you're talking about a date so long in the future, potentially, maybe we can get to a point where we can move it more quickly. I'm not going to just let it hang for too long, but it's really hard for me right now to set something in 2025, even though that might be just the reality. There are going to be a lot of motions. Going to be a lot of motions about the death penalty as well. I'm realizing to think that we have to have a case so far in the future. But if that's what is the right thing for everything, to do it correctly, we don't want to do this twice. We don't want to do this 3 times, because no matter what happens, okay, if he's convicted, it's going to be appeal. That's also a challenge. So my heart goes out to the victims. I can't even imagine the pain, the grief, because you can't really go forward with your life without this hanging over your head. So, sorry. I want to do the right thing.
March 2025 is what they're targeting as a date here. That's the earliest this trial is going to happen. Our understanding, this thing could take 3-4+ months.
You heard it, folks. Mark your calendars for 2025, because this trial is going to be one for the history books. It's going to be a long road, so stay tuned for more updates as we wait to see how it all unfolds. As always, stay informed, stay curious, and never stop exploring.